Thank you for joining me today. I'm Georgios Oikonomou. I'm a professor at the University of Liverpool, and I will spend the rest, like the next 20 minutes, talking to you about some work we've done on lameness genetics and a new project that is trying to bring lameness data together to improve the current genetic evaluations. So when we think about the role of genetics in anything really of interest, or any phenotype, as we call, of interest, like milk production, we know that it's usually a function of like environmental effects and genotype effects. So if we're looking at genetic improvements, we are asking the question whether what we want to improve is heritable, how big the genetic component it may be. And when we talk about lameness, obviously we know it's a big challenge for our herds, and maybe someone will question whether genetics has a role to play or not. So we've been doing some work at the University of Liverpool looking into the role that genetics may have to play in lameness susceptibility. And to do this, we've been monitoring a population of 2,400 cows quite intensively at all these time points. Before calving, at calving, early lactation, and late lactation, we would pick all 4 feet up, and the same person effectively recorded any lesions on their feet. So we were not just looking at mobility, but we were actually collecting lesion data. And that would be details like, whether it had like mild bruising or severe bruising, white line lesions, sole ulcers, any digital dermatitis lesion was recorded. And on top of that, these 2,400 animals, we collected all this information. We also genotyped them, and we used this information to look into the genetic component of these problems. We also used the genotypes to get the breeding values from HTB. So all these animals, we use their genotypes to get from HTB any current evaluations that we can get for our animals in the UK. The first thing we did with this data was to show that genetics is actually quite important for all the important lesions. So if you look at the heritability that we're getting for all these traits, you see that sole hemorrhage was at 20%, sole ulcer was at 29%, white line was not as heritable, but it was still there at 6%, and digital dermatitis was just above 30. So these are pretty high heritabilities, which suggest that genetics may have a bigger role to play in lameness than we may thought. And therefore, that means that we can achieve genetic improvement. And for any scheme, when we want to improve something genetically, we need to record what we call appropriate traits and use them to estimate breeding values. So that's the next question here, is what do we use? If we accept that genetics is important for lameness, what do we use? What do we select for? We have all these traits in our genetic evaluations, and I think historically, we've been looking a lot at feet and legs trait or locomotion, which are, feet and legs is mainly conformation, is looking at things like foot angle or how straight or not the back legs are, and so on. This is what I would call indirect trait. It's like looking at conformation to improve something else. But we may also be able to use more direct traits, which in the case of lameness would be whether a cow has developed lameness or not, whether a cow had lesions at foot trimming events or not. So an HDB a few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, launched the Lameness Advantage Index, which will include type data, but will also include actual lameness records. So that would be coming either from milk recording organizations, which we know are not necessarily the best source of lameness data. Most farmers don't record lameness on CIS and NMR, but there is some data coming in directly on lameness on this. And we also have some digital dermatitis records coming from the Holstein UK classifiers. So that again is not perfect. It's just once in an animal's life. As they get classified, the classifier will try to see whether this cow has a digital dermatitis lesion, but it's direct records. We used our data set and our genomic data to test whether these evaluations, the lameness advantage and the DD index evaluations, are already making a difference. And if I'm honest, I did this because I expected, because of the phenotypes not being that great, that it will not yet be where we would like it to be. And I was proven wrong. And these evaluations are already working really well. And these are results I'm very excited about. So as I said, these 2,400 cows were all genotyped. So we could get from HDB. HDB only got the genotypes. They did not get our lameness records. They didn't know what did we actually find on this cow's feet. So based on the genotypes, they told us that some of our cows were negative on lameness advantage, which is bad genetics for lameness. And some cows were positive, which is what HDB thinks is good genetics for lameness. When we looked at how this translated on our population on actual lesion frequency, you can see that we have some really exciting results. Just to explain this graph here, this is the lameness advantage evaluation. That's different parities, so younger animals, older animals. So this is good genetics up here. This is bad genetics. This is the actual lesion frequency we had in our study. So if we look, for example, this is a very impressive result here on older cows. If you look at sole ulcers, very important, very painful. The best genetics were down to approximately 10% sole ulcers. The worst genetics was above 40. So this is a huge difference that is really down to the genetics. What we're looking at here is the genetic evaluation that we already get from HDB. As I said, white line was not as heritable, so the trends are not that strong, but you can still see that as the genetic value goes down, the incidence goes up. And that's the same for bruising. If you look at younger animals, we know that's where we get a lot of our challenges. The first calving is when they get the first bruising events. You can see that best genetics we're still getting bruising, just above 40%, but the bad genetics were above 60%. So big differences, and all these differences were what we call statistically significant. Another way of looking at this was that for every 2-point decrease in lameness advantage, the sole ulcer risk would double in this population. Or if you look at these numbers here, -1 lameness advantage cows, 32% risk of sole ulcer, +1, it was 16. When we looked at the DD index, when we looked at lameness advantage and digital dermatitis, we did see that higher lameness advantage values were associated with a small reduction in the odds of having DD. But when we looked at the DD index, which is specific to digital dermatitis, we had some really strong results there. So for every 1-point increase in the DD index, so better genetics for digital dermatitis, we would have a 61% reduction in the odds of having DD. This is our whole population. And when you look here, this is the bad genetics for digital dermatitis. 60% of these cows had digital dermatitis at some point in our study. When you look at the good genetics, it's 20%. So it's a really strong association, which to me is a no-brainer now that we need to look and select for lameness advantage and DD index, especially if we do have problems with lameness in our herd. When we actually did the same looking at these feet and leg traits, they were not working as well. So that's another thing that is important to keep in mind, because I know, and from the work I do, I'm a cattle vet, I still do clinical work, herd health work, and it's quite common to still get from a farmer that, yeah, we do want to select for less lameness, and we select for better feet and legs, so which is conformation. We now have lameness advantage, so I would advise that based on our results, lameness advantage is better to select for comparing to conformation traits. PLI will include lameness advantage, which is good, and digital dermatitis index. So just selecting on PLI will also eventually get us there. But I think if we're really after big improvements on lameness genetics, we should prioritize high lameness advantage and high DD index animals. But what's the next step now in my talk is to talk about this new project we're doing. As I said, the phenotypes, the information we currently use for lameness advantage and DD index can get better. They don't use all the available information there on lesions, on lameness records. And that is the new project that I am leading at the University of Liverpool, collaborating with FRCVS and the University of Nottingham, where what we are trying to do is to use sources of data. So a lot of dairy farmers now will have a professional foot trimmer that will, for example, go on the farm and use a software called All4Feet, electronically recording anything they do at the crash. A lot of farmers use Uniform Agri to record lameness records, or Dairy Comp, or vets that use Vet Impress. All these data are cloud stored, so are accessible for us to use to improve the genetic evaluations, but they're not currently feeding into lameness advantage. As I said, lameness advantage is only using milk recording data. So what we are trying to do, we have created what we call the UK Hoof Health Registry, and that's managed by us at the University of Liverpool, where we are trying to get consent from the farmers to access these records. We're doing a lot of knowledge exchange meetings like this one, trying to explain that we will maintain everything confidentially. We will protect this data. We're not sharing. They're not being used for auditing. All they're going to be used for is for research on lameness genetics, but more importantly, for feeding into the lameness advantage evaluations. So we do that in partnership with HDB. So once we get this data together, we hope to share this data with HDB so that we can improve the lameness advantage evaluations, which, as I showed you, already work really well. So if we could also get this improved phenotypic information in, we can really make differences on lameness genetics for our animals. As I said, we're doing a lot of, you may have seen this before, we are doing articles, we're doing meetings. We do have close to 400 farms that have already signed up, and we also get a lot of help from foot trimmers. But obviously, there is a lot more than 400 farmers that milk record and have this usable data. So we are really hoping to get more. We do have a small stand just here if you want more information. And there is a way to very quickly scan. If you scan this, you can, if you're a dairy farmer that uses some of these softwares, you can give us the consent form just by scanning this with your phone and filling in. It takes 5 minutes, I think, to fill in the consent form. We're also here all day to answer questions. I think my team has given out a leaflet that has a little bit more information for you about this. And these are all our industry partners. I'm really lucky to have a lot of industry support. It is a good project, I think. It's a public good project. We're not trying to get this data to profit from. We're just hoping to improve these lameness genetic evaluations that eventually will benefit the UK dairy farmer. I don't know how we are with time. I did try to cover for, yeah, so if we have some time, I can answer questions, anything you want to ask really about this work. Maybe it was very clear. Yeah, okay. Well, I think some of the results are really obvious that genetic selection can help with lameness. And more information, I don't know if you've come across Mike Coffey, who is one of our collaborators. He's a geneticist up in SRUC that is doing the work, who keeps saying that phenotype is king in the age of genotype. The more information, the more data we have, the more accurate our genetic evaluations will be. If there are no questions, I suppose, I mean, we can give time for the next, to set up the next panel. Thank you so much, for being here. Yeah.